Hello, and welcome to today's Endowment for Middle East Truth webinar. My name is Joseph Epstein, and I am Emet's Director of Legislative Affairs. It is my pleasure today to host Dr. Zev Hanan, an Israeli expert on the former Soviet Union and Russian-speaking Jewish communities. Dr. Hanan currently heads the Post-Soviet Conflicts Research Program at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University, and he is also the academic chairman of the Institute for Euro-Asian Jewish Studies. He previously worked as a professor at Ariel and Tel Aviv universities and was the chief scientist of the Israeli Ministry of Aliyah and Integration. He has published 9 books and countless articles in his field. For our webinar, Dr. Hanan will examine bilateral relations between Israel and both Russia and Ukraine, how Israel fits into the conflict between the West and Russia, and Russia's expanding interest in the Middle East and the Global South. Before we start, I'd like to mention that our work is only possible with the support of you all. If you find what we do informative and helpful, please consider sponsoring a future webinar or contributing to Emet. It is your help and support that allows us to continue with our important work on Capitol Hill to ensure a prosperous and peaceful Israel in the Middle East, fight the influence of the Iranian regime, increase U.S. national security, and improve the welfare of Jewish Americans. Today's webinar will be recorded for future viewing, and I encourage those of you who find the webinar informative to share the link once it has been sent out. If you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to write them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Zev Hanan.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks to everybody who found the time and joined this webinar. I will be happy to share with you a few of my ideas concerning the Russian factor here in the Middle East, and with your permission, I will focus on 3 issues. First, on the nature of a current Middle Eastern conflict, its transformation from Arab-Israeli conflict to the new model on the Middle Eastern conflict, which has very little, if anything, to do with the traditional understanding of the Middle Eastern problem. Second, I will say a few words about specifically on Russian interest here in the Middle East and Israeli-Russian relations, and not maybe, I will also, at the end, I will say a few words and few sentences about bilateral relations between Jerusalem and Moscow and Jerusalem and Kiev. That means in order to maybe provide a little bit better understanding, and here I would be interested also to learn your ideas about it, whether we may define the current war in the Middle East as one of the fronts of the more global conflict, together with the front in the Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and other conflicts in the modern world, as like a general global conflict, which we will define the Third World War. That means the new war of the 21st century, which is very different from what we experienced, the mankind experienced in the previous 20th century. I am talking about First World War and the Second World War. So let me address to the 3 points, taking between 25 to 30 minutes, and then I will be pleased to answer your questions if there will be any, as well as to hear your comments and recommendations. So let us start with the first point. If we are talking about Middle Eastern conflict at the moment, so normally we believe that its Middle Eastern conflict is equivalent of the Arab-Israeli conflict. In fact, in the course of the recent 20 to 25 years, this process, this already changed. The nature of the Middle Eastern conflicts changed. I would say that we are witnessing the exhausting of the Arab-Israeli conflict that started in the early, in this second decade of this century, with the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, which very quickly was transformed to, let me say, Islamist winter, as one of my colleagues at Tel Aviv University did describe it. And as well as the autumn of the great powers here in the Middle East, and their status already changed. Then I would say that Arab-Israeli conflict is almost totally exhausted in the beginning of this century, this decade, I'm sorry, with the signing of the so-called Abrahamic Accords between Israel and some of the countries of the Persian Gulf or Arab Gulf, as they prefer to call it. That means countries that are members of the so-called Saudi Arabia bloc, moderate pro-Western, it's better to say pro-American Arab Sunni countries. That's Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. Then, as we know, a few other Arab countries joined it. We are talking about Morocco, and we are talking about Northern Sudan, and some other Arab countries were staying in line. And we expected that until the end of this year, we would be happy to observe the ceremony near there in the meadow near the White House when the Israeli Prime Minister, Saudi Arabia King or Prince, and American President are shaking hands after the signing of the agreement on normalization of the diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Meantime, that never happened because of this new war in the Middle East, Israeli operation in Gaza, and this extending conflict here in the Middle East. I would say the first big war in the Middle East of the 21st century. We can define it as the war between global South and global North. And this is the new understanding, a new essence of the Middle Eastern conflict, which is not Arab-Israeli conflict anymore, which is about being over. And if this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel would be signed, we might say that this 100 years long Arab-Israeli conflict will be over. Then that might become a trigger of joining of the many other Arab countries, and after them some Muslim countries which are not Arab but still we were talking about Pakistan, Malaysia, and even Indonesia, the mostly populated Muslim nation in the world. That didn't happen because of this war in Gaza, and there are those who are unhappy about it. We Israelis are unhappy about it. I think you Americans are also unhappy about it. But there are some subjects in this world politics which are very happy about it. And this is the second point which my current presentation will be focused about. Just to concluding this first point, what is the current essence of the Middle Eastern conflict? I would say that here in the Middle East, we have like a chapter of the confrontation between the global North, that means Western democratic nations headed by the United States, and the global South. We're talking about non-Western or anti-Western countries which raised the banner of new anti-colonialism, and regardless where these countries are geographically situated. From this point of view, we might say that Israel and Japan are members of the Northern Bloc, and countries like Russia are in the Southern Bloc. We know that both in the Northern Bloc, there is a competition between various influence and power centers to rule this bloc. United States, official leadership of the European Union, and some other candidates for that. In the Southern Bloc, we see the competition for leadership between at least three superpowers, at least that they define themselves. This is China, India, and Russia. And Israel, as we know, as I said, it's part of the club of Western democratic nations. We believe that if and when, not if, when, because it's the idea is not it's postponed but not cancelled, of normalization of relations between Riyadh and Jerusalem will become effective. we might say that it will not be not also it will be the end of Arab-Israeli conflict in their classical forms, but also I would say it will be the beginning of the bloc, military defense bloc or alliance, the so-called Middle Eastern NATO. I am not talking about institutional understanding of this word. I am talking about intersection, interrelations between various bilateral and multilateral defense agreements, which will be directed against the so-called Iranian bloc, just this chapter of this global south here in the Middle East. We are talking about Iran themselves. We are talking about Iranian allies like some of the Gulf countries. First of all, countries which are now we are talking a lot about this emirate, which is involved in negotiations, informal negotiations between Israel and Hamas. For example, we are talking about countries which are in fact satellites of Iran, Syria, Iraq. We are talking about quasi-states like Houthi state, in fact, quasi-state in northern Yemen, and Hamas Islamist state in the Gaza Strip. And we are talking about Iranian proxy, the Shia and not only Shia militias, which are sponsored, supported, armed, and financed by Iran. And this is actually the line of the confrontation between these two forces, two big subjects. We may say that Israel is, of course, on the western side of of this confrontation, and it's also interesting that this front line divides a certain part of Israeli society. First of all, I'm talking of so-called Arab Israelis, or as some of them prefer to define themselves as Palestinians of 1948, or internal Palestinians, and some people call them. We have, for example, after the so-called Norwegian agreements or Oslo agreements, we saw the substantial identity transformation among the Israeli Arabs. If before the 1990s, majority of them defined themselves as Israeli Arabs or simply Israelis, then we saw the growing Palestinian identity among them. And in the recent years, however, we see that the trends changed. There is a inflation of this mainstream in the Arab-Israeli society. The Palestinian identity is decreasing, and instead of that, we see the increasing of two other models of identity. One is actually Israeli identity, coming back to Israeli identity, Arab Israeli identity, and second, the increasing or strengthening of the Islamist identity. So this is actually the front line between global South and global North within the Israeli society, or a specific part of the Israeli society. I would also say that the question, it's a good question, who will win in this current Middle Eastern war? I would say probably the first war between, among very few, among the first wars between global South and global North here in the Middle East. If Israel, that means that we are the bloc of the camp of liberal Western countries are winning, and anti-Western, totalitarian and authoritarian, radical Islamist, and so on and so forth regimes are actually losing. In fact, we saw a few days ago how it worked when at night of the 14th of April, Iran sent many hundreds of their missiles and drones to attack the Israeli objects, and 99% of them were destroyed even before they entered the Israeli airspace. It was done together by Israeli air defense, air force, and air defense of the United States, Britain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. which means that we now see how this bloc, this Middle Eastern NATO, will work in the future. That might happen after the end of this war. As I said, it was postponed but not cancelled, was not removed from the table. Now let us say a few words about Russia. I would say that Russian interests, Russia's interest in the Middle East and in the global South are actually pretty clear. According to them, establishment of the alliance between United States, Israel, and moderate Saudi bloc countries, Arab countries, pro-Western countries, or pro-American countries, will be a great damage to their interest and the interests of Russia, I mean. So I'm not sure that Russia was involved in planning and organizing of the 7th of October 2023 attack on Israel. However, I would say that Kremlin and Moscow are enjoying the results. First of all, the question of normalization of Saudi Arabia-Israeli relations are postponed, which is, as far as Russia is concerned, postpones or puts a substantial question mark on establishment of this alliance in the Middle East, anti-Iranian, which means also anti-Russian alliance here in the Middle East. Second, it worked for propaganda, Russian propaganda. Immediately after the 7th of October, probably those of you who are interested, who observe what is going on in Moscow and in Russia in general, paid attention to a lot of declarations and exclamations and publications and discussions and briefings of Russian politicians and public figures that are saying, including Russian President Vladimir Putin himself, as well as Russian Foreign Minister and some other public figures and officials, who are saying that this is a result of failed American policy in the Middle East. Americans who were not letting Russia to interfere, to be a part of the Middle Eastern process and peace process, and monopolized Israeli-Palestinian Arab dialogue, actually failed, which means that Russia would be able to conduct this issue much more effectively. This is, of course, a propagandistic point, but they use it. Mostly, it's oriented inside rather than outside, but still they didn't leave the concept of the so-called Russian world, yeah? That means Russian-speaking diasporas all over the world, regardless their ethnic origin. Ethnic Russians, ethnic non-Russians, and even ethnic Jews here in Israel. That is why in the official doctrine of Russia, of Kremlin, Israel, with its more than 1 million strong Russian-speaking community, Olim, that means Jewish resettlers, Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union, overwhelmingly Russian-speaking, is a part of this Russian world. And now it's probably a good time to follow to the third point concerning the bilateral relations between Russia and Ukraine on one side and Israel on the other side. You might know, ladies and gentlemen, that the recent decade, or even more than a decade and a half, since early years of the previous decade, it was a period of honeymoon between Moscow and Jerusalem. When starting from the second spell in office of Vladimir Putin and coming back to power in 2009 of Benjamin Netanyahu as a prime minister, when he established his second government. It was a period of closing of intensive dialogue between Israel and Russia, and in some way it was a successful dialogue. At a certain point, both countries changed the policy in terms of each other, that meaning concerning each other. And if in the 1990s, under the Gorbachev and Yeltsin times, it was pretty clear that for Russia, Israel, and the Middle East had played a peripheral role in their foreign policy interests since the end of the first decade of the century, and of course, starting from the second decade of this century, Russia paid more and more attention to regain its status here as a great power in the Middle East. As we all know, colleagues, if any country pretends to be a superpower, a global superpower, this or that way, it has to be present here in the Middle East. And one of those who like set the rules of the game. Actually, we understood it that Russia is changing the line and tries to be one of the main game players here in the Middle East after the famous Munich speech of Vladimir Putin of 2007, and he openly declared that Russia interested to regain its as a country which got inherited the status of the Soviet Union and wants to regain its global status as a global superpower. Here in the Middle East, I'm talking from Jerusalem at the moment. So here in the Middle East, the focus of this policy was in the declaration of Vladimir Putin, as well as top-rank foreign policy Russian officials, that Russia is not interested to be like just a simple member of the Middle Eastern Quarter, which means United States, European Union, United Nations, and Russia, of the Middle Eastern peace process, because neither peace process itself nor the Russian participation in this Middle Eastern Quarter has no meaning in principle. So Russia is going to undertake and to conduct its own policy, and this own policy includes three major points. First, to get back the areas of the Russian influence. First of all, in the countries with the special Russian interests, like Syria, like Iraq, like Libya, and some other places. Second, Israel, which, as I said, more than 1 million strong Russian-speaking community. And third, to present itself as a force which is able to moderate between various forces, opposite to what they believe Americans are unable to do. That means to speak equally with Iran and Turkey, Israel and Iran, Sunni and Shia, with Hamas and Organization of Liberation of Palestine. That means with Gaza and Ramallah, and so on and so forth. In some way, it worked, but at a certain point, it stopped working, in fact. I think that the end of that was this current Gaza war, I would say. In principle, it is pretty clear that Russia, despite of the fact that it tries to intervene this or that way into negotiations and relations, and to still present itself as a country, as a subject which cooperates with Iran on one way, on one side, on the other side, still interested to develop cooperation with the Sunni world, Arab Sunni world, didn't much succeed in that, neither with the first issue nor with the second. I would say that after the beginning of war in Ukraine, that means after the 4th of February, 2022, the special relations between Moscow and Jerusalem started to decrease. As you know, Israel didn't join the international sanctions on Russia, imposed on Russia, but supported diplomatically and politically, supported Ukraine Ukrainians were not happy with the scope, with the level of this support, and they wanted military support, which Israel decided to refrain from. First of all, because of the several reasons. First of all, Israel still interested in some sort of coordination in Syria with Russia in order to have an open hands, meaning freedom of action against the Iranian proxy in Syria, and in order to prevent them from opening another Iranian front against Israel. And to stop provision of armament that will change the rules of the game on the ground via Syria to Lebanese Hezbollah. Russians are also not interested in open confrontation with Israel because they're deeply involved in the war in Ukraine, and they don't need another front for that. This actually official explanation why both sides are trying to show their relations as asakim karagil, as we say in Hebrew, as you say, business as usual, meaning that they still conduct sort of correct relations without increasing the confrontation and escalating the conflict between Moscow and Jerusalem. And that point concerning Israeli interest is actually a 500,000 strong Russian Jewish community, which Israel has some responsibility of the Jews in the diaspora. You probably know about increasing the level of anti-Semitism in Russia, and Israeli government believes that Jerusalem should do everything in its power in order to defend our fellow tribesmen in the Russian Federation. As far as Israeli-Ukrainian relations are concerned, I would say that the situation of mutual disappointment and even in some way diplomatic conflict decreased or almost disappeared after the 7th of October last year. We see Ukraine at the moment is probably one of the most pro-Israeli countries in Europe. Kiev supported Israel without any questions, while Russia supported Hamas, in fact. That means the situation when Russia didn't take any side and tried to moderate between various objects and forces in the Middle East is finished. Russia took a side, and Israel is not that side, I would say. So again, I don't believe that Russia openly supports Hamas aggression against Israel, but in fact, it's much more positively approach to Hamas rather than Israel. We see it like welcoming of Hamas delegations in Moscow and supporting financially, meaning using this Moscow Stock Exchange to laundry money that at the end of the day go to Hamas and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure up to what degree all these gossips that there are several Russian military consultants in the Gaza Strip that helped to develop and to plan this Hamas operation against Israel on the eve of the 7th of October last year. But I think it's pretty unlikely. However, as I said, Moscow used everything, I mean, all the profits from this current war. As far as Israel-Ukrainian relations are concerned, I believe that at the moment they're improving pretty quickly. And we see it also on the government level, on the public level, civil society level. If you will have a look on public opinion polls in Ukraine, I would say that, the local pollsters show that Hamas and Palestinian support decreased to counted percents, 2%, 3%, 5%. lower than the statistical mistakes, 4.5% in this sort of opinion polls. In Israel, Israeli society is almost totally pro-Ukrainian, including Russian-speaking community. So those in Moscow who believe that this 1 million Russian-speaking Israelis and their Israeli-born children and grandchildren are actually like a fifth column that would support Russia, it is not true. Opinion polls that I conducted, for instance, as a university professor and formerly chief scientist at the Aliyah and Integration Ministry, show that majority of Russian-speaking Israelis didn't think that Israel should support Russia in its conflict with Ukraine after the 2014, I mean, not just now, within this recent decade. And also didn't think that Israel should be reoriented, establish strategic partnership with Moscow. The answer is no. On the other hand, we never succeeded to persuade our leadership, Israeli leadership, that they are mistaken while thinking that good relations with Putin and Moscow means good relations with the Israeli Russian-speaking voters. This is not true. And if, for instance, between 2014 till February 2022, majority of Russian-speaking Israelis, according to these polls, they believe that Israel should not interfere in Russia-Ukrainian conflict. So after February 2022, overwhelming majority of both Russian and speaking and non-Russian speaking Israelis believe that Israel should be on Ukrainian side. That more or less the situation. I think I will stop here and will be happy to answer your questions and hear your comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Condon. So I have one question. I believe it was last year that Putin declared that Russia would lead the anti-colonial global struggle. And to many observers, this sort of seemed like a cynical throwback to the Soviet Union's policy. So I wanted to ask you, could you explain the similarities and differences between the Soviet Union's aims then and Russia's now?
Well, it's pretty, I would say it's not an easy question, but a pretty easy answer. The answer is that was unofficial declaration of Mr. Putin. And I would say ideologists, if I may say, they use this word, of the Kremlin pool. Guys, I was speaking with, I mean, in various occasions, including this Valdai Club and so on, those who were actually writing this the new Russian civilization ideology of the Russian world, they were pretty frank by saying that, first of all, they tried all the Western models of identity. Russia in the process of in search of identity. So they tried the so-called ethnic nation, federation of ethnic nations, and they also tried to establish civic nation, and in both cases they failed. So what is left is actually empire identity. So according to Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov, the current Russia is actually inherited the tradition of Russia's liberal democratic movement, and simultaneously of the Soviet Union, and simultaneously of the Russian Empire. So altogether. So this altogether means that they declare that they inherited the Russian tradition of all generations, starting from the Kiev Russia, Kiev Rus, and finishing with Andrei Sakharov and all this democratic movement. That means this is monopoly of Kremlin. From this point of view, the so-called socialist orientation of the third world and sponsorship of so-called non-alignment movement, not much left from it, but still, you know. And the bloc of so-called new Marxist regimes in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and what is left from the communist bloc, that actually they believe that that's monopoly of Russia, then the foreign policy, like we say in Hebrew, be'etem, v'midniyut chutz be'etem, and accordingly, we observe the current elements of the Russian foreign policy. That's my answer, more or less.
Thank you so much. So we had some questions from the audience about the impact of the change, especially October 7th, on Jews living in Russia. I know in some of the Muslim republics, such as Dagestan, we've seen, massive displays of anti-Jewish rhetoric and even a massive attempted pogrom. So I wanted to ask you, how has it been for Jews living in Russia, and how does it differ in different Russian republics?
Well, also a very good question. I would say it's $1 million question, but it's a multi-billion-dollar question, I would say. It was pretty clear that anti-Semitism, Soviet-style anti-Semitism, never disappeared. It became heightened. So all the opinion polls and studies that were done by Levada Center, by Russian Jewish Congress, various subjects, Israeli Ministry for the Diaspora Affairs, and so on and so forth, they showed that majority of Russians, they are not open anti-Semites, but they still carriers of the so-called hidden anti-Semitism. And they have nothing against Jews in a, like we say, in a quiet time. But if there will be a government demand on an internal enemy, they would easily and readily would join any racist xenophobia, including anti-Semitism. That's exactly what happened at the moment. So that's an academic answer. And if you're asking me as Israeli, I would say to my Russian Jewish brothers, guys, what you're waiting for? Really? Really, what you're waiting for?
Yeah, I
No answer.
could
No
not agree
answer,
with
yeah?
you more.
No answer. Okay, so that's more or less what I can say about it.
What do you think they are waiting for? What do you think is stopping many of the Jews living in Russia from actually immigrating to Israel, or at the very least Europe or the United States?
First of all, many of the Russian-speaking Jews, I'm talking about extended Jewish population, more than 500,000 people. 60% of it are concentrated in the capital cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are pretty well off there. They're middle and upper middle class. They're not sure that they will be able to preserve their level of life and quality of life in any other place. That's one point. Second point, they might live for a European country or United States, but as you know, Joseph, it's not a secret that Europeans and Americans are quite suspicious concerning Russian citizens. Everything is toxic concerning Russia. So pretty suspicious concerning Russian citizens, the holders of the Russian passports, regardless their ideological, political orientation or ethnic origin. That means that is why Aliyah from Ukraine stopped in May 2022, and the only Western country which is still open gates. The gates are open for Russian citizens that meet the regulations and requirements of the Israeli law of return is Israel. That's Israel. So the Aliyah from the former Soviet Union, 70 to 80% are actually Aliyah from Russia. But what are doing their counterparts and parents and children and brothers and sisters and the extended family? What are they still? Why they're sitting there? They believe that, okay, that's your question is like question of Jabotinsky to German Jews. Why are you still sitting there after 1933? I'm not comparing anything with anybody, okay, with anything and anybody with anybody, but that's more or less the situation. People believe in or hope for the best. and they are not sure that they will may continue their career. I mean, it's already more than 30 years after the destruction of the Soviet Union. People spend this time building up their life, their careers, their future in Russia. So they are not sure that now, if they were 25, 30 at that time, now they are 55, 60, they are not sure that they may go through this way again now at this age.
Thank you. So as you mentioned earlier, since October 7th, Russian-Israeli relations have deteriorated, and Israeli-Ukrainian relations have gotten a lot better. What do you see the future of Israeli-Ukrainian relations? And do you think at some point we could see Israeli deliveries of certain types of military technology to Ukraine?
As you probably know, Joseph, we tried it a few years ago. It was like a period of time when military cooperation between Israel and Ukraine was discussed in 2016 and 2017 and so on. I believe that you know that Israeli foreign policy doctrine is based on the three circles. The first circle, that at any given moment of time, Israel should have relations of strategic partnership with one of the superpowers. It used to be France, now it's United States. The second round, actually, Israel always was directed, Israeli foreign policy, on establishment of the strategic partnership with the strongholds, countries which are strongholds in their area, beyond the circle of Arab-Israeli conflict. This is India. I see the question in the chat about India. Elizabeth is asking, I'm surprised that you put India in the global south. India is not hostile to Israel, neither to the United States. A lot of US companies have diversified from China to invest in India. It's true. The same was done by Israel as well, by the way. Like including personal relations between Netanyahu and Narendra Modi, Israeli investments there. So India is a good example as of military cooperation. Israel is unable to open storage and to pull out and take Iron Dome or whatever that Ukrainians ask, yeah, and simply to sell it. Israel actually needs it for itself to close the skies, yeah. And what is actually the way of cooperation is mostly of futures agreements, meaning like Israel signed agreements now with Czechia, with Finland, with some other European, Germany, some Great Britain, some other European countries, which in the current situation prefer to invest more money into their defense programs. But these agreements are actually based on the understanding that Israeli armament will be provided in 2025, 2027, 2030. I mean, in the next 5 to 7 years. Ukraine is not interested in that. Ukraine is interested to get it now. Okay. Second approach, and we see it in Israeli cooperation with India, again, coming back to that very important country. India actually got Israeli technology. That the second way of military cooperation, that meaning provision of technology and helping to develop the production of armaments, missiles, drones, artillery, and so on, and like automatic rifles, rockets, and so on and so forth, anti-tank rockets, and so on and so forth, there on the place. And now it works. Israel is now buying the Indian military production back based from the factories that are working on the basis of Israeli technology, by the way. So that might happen with Ukraine. It was discussed, by the way, that the way it happened with Azerbaijan, for instance, and it was discussed a few years ago with Ukraine, but Kiev preferred that time strategic cooperation with Turkey rather than with Israel. Baraktar and not not Israeli advanced Israeli drones, for instance. Yeah. So I think that after the end of the war, we might both sides might come back to this discussion. And third, and I think even more important, Israel suggested a different thing. Ukraine, after the war, will enter. It's more or less clear into the process of reconstruction of their main capital, that means their main industry and social sphere, education, healthcare system, and so on and so forth. That's what Israel could help.
Thank you. So as you mentioned earlier, you see the conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel as connected in an overall war between the global North and the global South. The global North, of course, being comprised mainly of what you could also call the West. So in general, popular opinion in the West is very anti-Russia and a lot more pro-Ukrainian. However, the same cannot necessarily be said about Israel. And I wanted to ask, how can Western leaders better rally their populations to really understand that these conflicts are connected and understand the importance to them personally of actually succeeding in these conflicts?
You mean Russia-Ukrainian conflict or Israel-Hamas conflict?
No, together, but especially in Israel, as just because in general these populations are already pretty anti-Russia, but the same can't be said about Hamas, the Palestinians.
I think that majority of the Western country population are not interested in this conflict. They're interested in the gas prices, in inflation, and labor opportunities, in the education for children, in the better housing, and so on and so forth. And somewhere on the margins, the foreign policy issues, as you know, are on the margins of every electoral campaign, both in Europe and in North America, United States, Canada, and so on. So you probably know better than me what opinion polls in the United States show. Theoretically, I would say that if we will put aside what we see in the university campuses and publications and works of all sort of, centers that enjoy the financial support of Gulf monarchies and so on, we would say that in general, representative opinion polls show that majority of American, for example, public on the side of Israel. The same we may say about European public opinion. You probably paid attention to YouGov research, recent research, and research a few months ago in England, United Kingdom, I mean. And it showed that 90% that time, 90% supported Israel, 90%, 19, I think, 19% supported, 19, supported Israel, 9 supported Palestinian Arabs, not necessarily Hamas. But the rest didn't support anybody or sympathize equally to the both sides, or not interested or don't care. Which means that we should not overestimate the anti-Israeli approach. I think that the Western public understands pretty well that Israel and Ukraine, they're conducting the same war, but on their own fronts. If you will have a look at the, again, on the YouGov study that were published recently, a couple of weeks ago at the end of March. They also polled Great Britain public what they think, whom they support. So we saw there that 29% supported Palestinian Arabs and 15% supported Israelis, which is twice more, or Israelis twice less than Palestinian Arabs. But the next question was whom you sympathize with in this war. Like about 75% sympathize with Palestinians and more than 60% sympathize with Israel. However, among those who sympathize with Palestinians, only 11% supported Hamas on what they did. So we shouldn't enter the panic, I would say. concerning that. I don't think that Western public might be not so illuminated, I mean, in concern of the Middle Eastern conflict, but they are not stupid at all.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you, since the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen Russia and Iran cooperate on a much deeper level, especially when it comes to on the military level. At the same time as Russia loses capacity that it formerly had around the world, just due to the war in Ukraine, we see Iran filling in a lot of these power vacuums, such as in the South Caucasus, in Syria. And so I wanted to ask you, how does that affect Russian-Iranian relations? And while we have seen a deeper level of cooperation, do you think there is still a good level of trust?
As far as the trust is concerned, my impression was, and this is not from today and not from yesterday, from quite a time ago, there is no trust between Iranians and Russians. No trust, including on the top level. I remember this a couple of times was present at this conference of international security conducted by the Russian Defense Ministry. It's like oxymoron, international security by the Russian Defense Ministry, but it's still. So I saw as they spoke to each other, Iranian generals and Russian generals. I didn't get an impression that they trust each other. Second point is that at the moment, Russia, which is more and more deep in this Ukrainian war in Ukraine, they have to leave some of the spheres of their influence and their interest, like Syria, like Southern Caucasus, and this is the place for Iranian infiltration. In Moscow, they're not very much happy about it. Still, they have to reconcile with this point because they need Iranian help, Iranian armament, Iranian shells, Iranian bullets, Iranian helicopters, Iranian drones, and so on and so forth. And in return, they have to permit them to extend their geopolitical influence. So whether it will continue this way, and at a certain point, both in Tehran and in Moscow, somebody will say enough is enough. It's a good question. Please invite me like in 6 months from now, and we will discuss it again.
Would be happy to. Just a very quick follow-up. Russia had formerly, as I understand, promised Iran Sukhoi fighter jets, which is something that the Iranians really need, considering how just outdated their Air Force is. But so far, they still haven't delivered the fighter jets. Do you know why that is, and do you think that they will deliver them sometime in the future?
I think I will start with the second question. I think they will. No other way. They need Iranian support in different fields. So there is no way but to provide what Iranians demand. In diplomatic field, in political field, in military field, in economic field, in nuclear field, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we saw Israeli response on Iran after the 14th of Iranian attack on Israel after the 14th of April. And the Israeli counterattack was on the air defense system near Natanz, as you know. Natanz, I'm sorry, near Natanz, near Natanz. And it is defended by the S-300. Quite advanced Russian Russian air defense systems. And Israel showed that actually for Israeli Air Force and for Israeli rocket divisions units, it will not be, if there will be a need to be there, so in any place of Iran, Russian defense systems provided to Iran will not be an obstacle. So at the moment, I would say that Tehran will increase their demands in terms of provision of the more and more advanced Russian military technologies to them. And I don't see any reason why in Moscow they will say no.
Thank you so much. It appears we are out of time. I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Khanin. It was a pleasure interviewing you. I'd also like to thank our audience for being with us today. And again, if you found the webinar informative, please share the link once it has been sent out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I still over answers to Mikhail Kursik, but maybe I will answer in writing or whatever if we don't have time anymore.
That would be great. Thank you.
He's asking, what has been the impact of Jews who live in Russia? No impact. They prefer to be out of this politics. So we have three different Jewish communities. The three biggest Jewish communities in the former Soviet Union: Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. Ukrainian community is totally mobilized in support of their government. A Russian community prefers not to interfere into the issue, and in Belarus, as far as I know, war in Ukraine is not the case of relations between Lukashenko administration and local Jewish community, organized Jewish community. So I would say that I might say that in Ukraine the impact is great. I mean, in diplomatic level, in public diplomacy level, in participation in war level, in relations with Israel level, and so on and so forth. In Russia, it's minimal, if at all. In Belarus, it's non-issue.
Thank you, Professor Khanin.
Thank you very much.